of Chav Tes Amid Beis 29b, and we had seen the statement of Rav that said that chametz on Pesach itself, whether it gets mixed up with its own kind or whether it gets mixed up with something else, it's going to be prohibited. And after Pesach, whether it gets mixed up, then if it gets mixed up in its own kind, meaning other breads or something similar to itself that tastes the same, it's going to be prohibited. However, shaloi b'minai, if it's going to get mixed up with something that's different than itself, it's going to be mutter, it's going to be permissible. And the Gemara had questioned and said, wait, what are we talking about? Are we talking about that it got mixed up with less than a 60th where it cannot give a taste? Sorry, if it less than a 60th and therefore it can give a taste, meaning it's one, the ratio is 1 in 40, let's say, or 1 in 50. And so it's going to give a taste. So who cares whether after Pesach it got mixed up with something else other than its own kind, meaning this is a chametz, it's a bread, and it got mixed up in a salad. It's giving flavor, so it should be prohibited even after Pesach. So it must be that it's talking about that it's less than it's a smaller ratio than 1 in 60. It's 1 in 1 in 100, 1 in 200. So it's not going to give flavor. And then so what's the reason that Rav says both whether on chametz it got mixed up in its own or in something else, b'minoi or shalei b'minoi, that it's asur. So we're in just about in the middle of the page, ela b'mashu, the middle of the line. Ela b'mashu. So it must be we're talking about that there is a minuscule amount, less than what can give flavor. Chametz b'zman bein b'minei bein shalei b'minei asur. And yet on Pesach, whether it got mixed up in another chametz kind, is something like itself, or in something that's not like its own, it's going to be prohibited. And the reason for this is Rav l'taimei. Rav is following his own opinion that we see elsewhere. The Rav Shmuel Damar Tavaya, that both Rav and Shmuel said, Kol isurin shebetorah b'minoi b'mashu. All prohibitions in the Torah are going to be prohibited in its own kind, b'mashu. As we talked about yesterday, that when something is mixed up with something of its own, there are two opinions. There's one opinion that says that min b'minoi b'mashu, since it's in its own kind, essentially never nullified, and even a minuscule amount is going to be prohibited. Or do we say the other way around, that since it can't give flavor, even a majority, even just 51% of the permissible thing is going to be is going to make it permitted. And Rav and Shmuel both say that min b'minoi b'mashu, that if it's mixed in its own kind, any tiny amount is going to nullify the entire thing, that mixture. Shaloi b'minoi b'nesim tam. And so on chametz and Pesach, really, when it mixes with other chametz, it should be nullified. Mixes something that tastes alike, it's the same kind of thing, so it's never nullified. But if it mixes with something else, so you have chametz that got mixed up in a mixture that you can't extract it, so then and it's giving a flavor, so then it would only be prohibited if it's not batel, if it's not nullified, and that would be where the flavor can still be tasted, which we said is 1 in 60. Yes, we're still on 29b. So that would be 1 in 60. So why did Rav say that chametz and Pesach is going to be prohibited both whether it's mixed in its own kind or in something else, even though that it doesn't give a flavor? So Rav gozar chametz bezmanai, that Rav made a gzeira, shalei b'minoi ata b'minoi, that even if it's mixed in something that doesn't give a flavor, in something that's a different type, so you have your chametz mixed in with another food, and so really it should be nullified, and only if there's flavor will it not be nullified. And over here it's a small ratio. It's so small, insignificant, that it doesn't give flavor. Really, it should be nullified. Nevertheless, Rav says, since if it got mixed up with its own kind, if it got mixed up chametz, let's say breadcrumbs got mixed up with matzah meal, and now you can't tell it apart. And so it's going to be there is no nullification amount. Even one crumb would prohibit the entire mixture. So too, if this crumb of chametz got mixed into another food, say you're making jam and this crumb fell in, it's also going to be prohibited b'mashahu in a minuscule amount, on account of that would be the rule if it got mixed up in its own kind, in chametz, in breadcrumbs in matzah meal. So therefore, your breadcrumb that fell into the jam you're making is also going to be batel in a minuscule amount. So Rav Gazar chametz bezmanei, chametz on Pesach shalei b'minoi ato b'minoi, even if it got mixed up in something that's not its kind, on account of that the rule is that if it got mixed up with its own kind, it's going to be prohibited in a mashahu, in a minuscule amount. However, after Pesach, b'minoi aser, he says if it gets mixed up in its own kind, it's going to be prohibited. And this is Rabbi Yehuda. This is on account of that he says Allah is like Rabbi Yehuda, where who says that after Pesach there's also a prohibition of chametz. V'shaloi b'minoi mutar. However, if it gets mixed up in something of its own kind, not its own kind, so after Pesach your chametz gets mixed up in jam, there's no concern. There it's going to go only if you actually can taste it. The shalei b'zmanei, because after Pesach, v'shalei b'minoi, and it's not in its own kind, where it is actually nullified, atumina kula hayla gesrin, that on account of that, if it was its own kind, meaning breadcrumbs in matzah meal, that it wouldn't be nullified. So therefore, your breadcrumbs in jam also shouldn't be nullified. We don't say that after Pesach. And the distinction Rashi points out is that on Pesach, eating chametz is kares. It's a severe punishment, and so the Torah tells us it's by telling us that it is kares, the severity of the prohibition tells us that you have to be strict and not even take a chance of making a mistake and saying it's nullified 1 in 60, and then when it comes to mixing your matzah meal together with where your chametz fell into the matzah meal, you're also going to say it's nullified 1 in 60, and it's not. So you have to be strict. Whereas in after Pesach, where the prohibition, according to Rabbi Yehuda, changes from even though it's a Torah prohibition, according to Rabbi Yehuda, but it isn't a kares punishable prohibition. Therefore, if it got mixed in its own kind, chametz into matzah meal, there we're going to say it will not be nullified. But if your chametz fell into jam, into another type of food, it's only going to be prohibited if you can actually taste it.
I have a question.
That's the opinion of Rav.
I had a question.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure exactly how to ask it, but part of this seems to me there could be a question of timing. Like, when did this taruvus come into place? Did it come into effect, 5 seconds before the end of Pesach, or did it come into effect 5 minutes before the 6th hour Erev Pesach? I mean, when did this taruvus happen? And the second part of the question is that I started thinking about that. Is it possible? I mean, I'm thinking there probably is cases. Is it possible that something becomes chametz on Pesach? Something was perfectly kosher on Pesach becomes. I mean, we don't have. Some people don't do gebroks. I mean, I assume that's got to do with they're worried about something would become chametz on Pesach. So could something actually become chametz on Pesach and be part of a taruvus like right before Pesach was over?
Sure. So your first question is a question that we're not going to be able to get to now. Is how do you assess when a taruvus comes into place, when a mixture comes into place, when they actually mixed, or when I find out that it mixed? This is a discussion not for now, in a lengthy discussion in Shulchan Aruch. If you don't know about the mixture, does that mean there's no question until it comes to knowledge? And then at what point is the suffix nolad, is the doubt become a factor? a fascinating discussion, but not for now. This halacha does pertain particularly to chametz on Pesach. So if there's a mixture prior to Pesach, indeed it'll be more lenient. And the definition of that would be that at least the mixture happened before Pesach, or perhaps also, as you indicated, maybe I have to know that the mixture happened before Pesach. Be that as it may. For sure, it's possible to have chametz on Pesach. You have flour and you make dough and you let it rise. So that would be chametz that happened on Pesach. So there's no question that that's a possibility. In any case, so Rav says, chametz on Pesach, no nullification. Whether it's in its own kind or in something else, there's no nullification. After Pesach, there's nullification if it's in a different kind and it doesn't give flavor. Shmuel Amar, Shmuel says, chametz bezmanai b'minai aser. On Pesach, if chametz mixes with its own kind, so breadcrumbs into matzah meal, that's when we're going to say it's going to be prohibited. Shaloi b'minai, but if your chametz on Pesach, your breadcrumbs mixes into your jam, mutter, it's going to be permissible if it does not give flavor, if it's not 1 in 60. Shaloi b'zmanai, and after Pesach, bein b'minai, bein shaloi b'minai, whether the chametz gets mixed into its own kind, it breadcrumbs into matzah meal, or whether it mixes in something else, breadcrumbs into jam, mutter, it's going to be permissible. Now, the Gemara explains, chametz b'zmanai b'minai aser, on Pesach, chametz breadcrumbs mixing into matzah meal is going to be prohibited. Shmuel tamei the Rabbi Shmuel damatavai kalisson shabater b'minai aser u'mashel. This is like Rav and Shmuel said that on all in all the Torah, not just on Pesach, every prohibited item that mixes in its own kind, and we talked about yesterday, camel's milk that mixes into cow's milk, that it'll be, there's no nullification. It'll be prohibited. The entire mixture is prohibited, even if it's only a minuscule amount, 1 drop into a cup of milk. Shalei b'minai. However, if it's not its kind, you have the breadcrumbs mixing in with jam, but nice and tam. There, if it's a minuscule amount, it'll be nullified. It's only going to be prohibited if it actually gives flavor. And so, if it's a small amount, it's not going to be prohibited. Shaloi b'minan, atu minan lo gazar, because he says, I'm not going to make a fence and say, well, if the matzah meal falls into the breadcrumbs fall into matzah meal, there's no nullification. So when it fell into jam, also we have to not make a nullification just in case somebody thinks that it's nullified 1 in 60 in breadcrumbs and matzah meal as well. That's what Rav said. He says, Atu, on account of that it's not nullified in min b'minai, in its own kind, it's also where you have to make a fence and say it should not be nullified in a different kind, in breadcrumbs and jam, because chametz is kares, because chametz is so severe, it has a kares prohibition. And Shmuel says no such gzeira, no such fence. Shaloi b'zmanim, but after Pesach, bein b'minai, bein shaloi b'minai mutarin, it's going to be permissible either way, whether it's mixed in its own or not, Rabbi Shimon, because Shmuel follows the opinion of Rabbi Shimon that after Pesach, chametz is not prohibited. Even though the chametz is prohibited after Pesach, according to Rabbi Shimon, as a penalty, penalty for owning chametz, but that the Gemara is going to tell us soon is not going to be applicable here, as we'll see. Now we're now 7-8 lines from the bottom of Chavtes Samad base. The second word into the line, Rabbi Yochanan Amar, and Rabbi Yochanan says, chametz bezmanai, chametz on Pesach itself, bein b'mina, bein shali b'mina yaser, then regardless of whether it's mixed in its own kind or not, it's going to be prohibited. In other words, whether it's breadcrumbs into matzah meal or breadcrumbs into jam, either way, even a minuscule amount will prohibit the mixture. Aser b'nois and tam. It's only going to be prohibited if it gives flavor. There's no minuscule amount. It's only going to be prohibited if it actually gives flavor. Shaloi bezmanai. After Pesach, bein b'minai, bein shaloi b'minai muter. and after Pesach, whether it got mixed up in its own kind, breadcrumbs into matzah meal, or into shaloi b'mina and something else, meaning breadcrumbs and jam, it's going to be permissible. And he explains, chametz b'zmanei ben b'mina ben shaloi b'mina ben etzim tam, that on chametz on Pesach, it's going to be nullified if it doesn't give flavor, whether it got mixed into its own kind, meaning breadcrumbs into matzah meal, or into something else, shaloi b'mina, it got mixed into another flavor, so breadcrumbs and jam. Why? Rabbi Yochanan is according to his interpretation that he says elsewhere, the Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, both Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish teach, the Amri Tarvayu, Koli Surun Shabbatorah, everywhere else, universal rule, Bein B'mina, Bein Shaloi B'mina, everything is only going to be prohibited in a mixture in as much as it gives flavor. B'nois and tam. And therefore, here too on Chametz and Pesach, if it gives flavor, it's going to be prohibited. So if you have a ratio of 1 in 60, or it's greater than that, and therefore it's going to give flavor, a 1 in 59 or greater, so it's going to give a flavor, your breadcrumbs in the jam, and therefore it's going to be prohibited on Pesach. But if it's less, it'll be nullified. And min b'mina, even in its own kind, Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish say that in its own kind, it's also going to be nullified, as opposed to Rav and Shmuel, who said that a prohibition in its own kind is never nullified. Here, Rabbi Yochanan says it is nullified. Shaloi b'zmanei, and after Pesach, why is it permitted? Also, like Shmuel said, like Rabbi Shimon, that chametz on Pesach is prohibited, but chametz after Pesach does not have a Torah prohibition. And even though there is a rabbinic prohibition, we'll see about that in a moment. That's a penalty for keeping chametz over having chametz over Pesach. So now we're on Lamed Amud Aleph at the top, 30a at the top. Amar Rava. So Rava said hilchas chametz b'zmanei. The halacha is that chametz on Pesach itself, bein b'mina, bein shaloi b'mina, asav b'mashu, that we're going to be strict and say that chametz is prohibited regardless of whether it's breadcrumbs in matzah meal, so min b'mina in its own kind, or breadcrumbs and jam, so it's in a different kind. Either way, it'll be a minuscule amount, will not be nullified. And Rashi says because halacha is that that minuscule amounts are not nullified in its own kind. But the Tosfos and halacha is that that's not the reason. The reason is that this is a stringency in regards to chametz, that since chametz is kares, it'll be nullified. There is no nullification on Pesach itself. Regardless of whether it mixed in its own kind or in something else, it's not going to be nullified. Karav, like Rav said, now shaloi b'zmanei, but after Pesach, bein b'mina, bein shaloi b'mina muter, whether it got mixed in breadcrumbs in matzah meal, so in its own kind, or it mixed into something else, breadcrumbs and jam, it will be permissible, and the nullification is effective. Rabbi Shimon, like Rabbi Shimon says, that after Pesach there is no prohibition. Now the Gemara challenges him. Did Rava really say this? Rabbi Shimon kanasa kanis. But we saw yesterday that Rabbi Shimon penalized someone for having chametz on Pesach, and so even after Pesach, where there's no Torah prohibition, the chametz is prohibited. And so how can he say that it's nullified after Pesach? Since he transgressed Bal Yerabah and Matzah, the Torah prohibition of having chametz seen and in your possession. So over here it should be prohibited after Pesach. And Gemara says, "Hani mili be'eni." It's true, but that's only if it's extent. It's there as is. Avalai yidei taruvis. But if it's in a mixture, look, there's no penalty. The penalty only applies to chametz in its in its flesh. Chametz in as it is. As the Rava Tamein, Rava follows his opinion elsewhere. The Amar Rava said, "Ki avina be Rav Nachman." When we were in the academy of Rav Nachman, the house of Rav Nachman, ki avanafki shiva yom the Pischa, when Pesach was over, Amar Lan, he'd say to us, "Puku zvina chamira the bnei." He'd say, "Go and buy bread. Go buy dough from the soldiers, in other words, from the non-Jews, even though that it was made today and baked today, you can, meaning on Pesach, you can have it because the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon that after Pesach, chametz is going to be permissible. And since even though that a non-Jew had it, and Rabbi Shimon says a non-Jew's chametz on Pesach is going to be prohibited, but the non-Jew has no prohibition of having chametz on Pesach, so there's no penalty. So immediately after Pesach, you can go ahead and buy the chametz from the non-Jew. The next Gemara is going to deal with koshering vessels for Pesach. Essentially, how do we make sure, since we now know that chametz on Pesach is prohibited even in a minuscule amount, and even if it doesn't give flavor, but for sure if it gives flavor, so then I have to kosher my vessels. If I have a pot that I cooked chametz in, so now I have to get rid of that flavor or that minuscule amount that's in there in order to be able to use the pot on Pesach. So this is the concept of koshering vessels for Pesach. We're going to begin this conversation, and to understand some of it is that we have to understand that the concept is as the materials of the pot or the oven become hot, they expand, and there are pores which will now absorb some of the substances, some of the flavors and the aromas. And then when it cools, it condenses and it closes up and it seals it in there. And depending how porous a particular material is, it'll be whether it'll define for us whether or not it's possible to extract what's in there or not, or even whether it is absorbent to begin with. And the Torah tells us in regards to earthenware that became prohibited, Tana v'kirayim yutatz, that a earthenware oven needs to be broken. And we saw this earlier in regards to Tumah. And the idea is that earthenware vessels do not release their absorbed substances properly, and therefore the only way to kosher earthenware is by actually breaking it. Amar Rav, kederas b'Pesach yishaberu. These pots on Pesach need to be broken because you cannot extract the chametz from them. Mai l'shinu acha Pesach. He says, why do you have to break it? Just leave it till after Pesach. And then you can cook in there non-chametz, and it'll become permissible, because even Rav, who says that after Pesach there is a prohibition of chametz, like Rabbi Yehuda, and after Pesach the chametz of breadcrumbs in matzah meal has no nullification, but that's only because it's its own kind. But you don't have to do that. You can, even a chametz pot, a pot that had absorbed chametz, you can cook a non-chametz item in there. So make a soup, a vegetable soup, has no chametz in it, and that will extract whatever flavors in the pot, and it'll be nullified in there, because after Pesach, even Rav agrees that chametz is nullified in something that's not its kind, and obviously there's not that much chametz in the pot, so it'll be nullified in the contents of the pot. So he says, you're right. However, Gzeira Dilma Osalam said, but people are not careful to only cook non-chametz in a pot, and they're going to make the wrong mistake. They're going to make a mistake and cook a chametz in there, and it's going to be prohibited. Shmuel Amar, however, Shmuel says lo yishaver. He says, no, there's no need to break it. You can keep your pot until after Pesach. And you're allowed to cook even chametz in there, for sure non-chametz in there, because as Shmuel said, that after Pesach there's no prohibition, like Rabbi Shimon says, there's no prohibition of chametz after Pesach. And even though there was a penalty for maintaining chametz on Pesach, but that would not apply, as we saw, it doesn't apply to a mixture, and for sure will not apply to a pot that had an absorbent chametz there. And Shmuel said a halacha similar to this, where he warned the potters that were selling their pots, Ashvu zavini akadnaichu. Make sure not to price gouge after Pesach, because people are buying new pots because they they had chametz pots and they had to break them before Pesach, and they're buying new pots, don't price gouge. Keep the prices as they were beforehand. V'iloi, if you raise the prices after Pesach, darshina l'chuk Rabbi Shimon, I'm going to announce that the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon, that the chametz pots are permissible after Pesach, and nobody's going to break their pots, and therefore no one's going to buy any pots after Pesach. So the Gemara says, well, why didn't you make that announcement anyhow? Why didn't he make that announcement? Rabbi Shimon Svirle, because he says that is the halacha. Asrei the Rav Hava. Now he was in the place of Rav in Surah, and therefore he didn't want to, in the place of Rav, announce that the halacha is not like what Rav said, which is Rabbi Yehuda, and the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon, that after Pesach the chametz is permissible and they didn't have to break the pots, because it was there was a Marad Asr. This Rav was the Rav of that place. However, if there was going to be price gouging, he was going to tell everybody the halacha and say he warned the potters, just let good enough be is good enough, and sell the pots at the regular price, and people who broke their pots will buy new pots after Pesach. Otherwise, I'm going to tell them they don't have to break their pots to begin with. Hahu tenura de tachabetichya. Now, we're going to encounter a new halacha in order to learn how ovens work in this idea of koshering ovens and breaking earthenware. The halacha is you're not allowed to make dairy bread or meat bread. And the reason is because breads are used for the opposite kind, for meat and for dairy. And so if you make a dairy bread, you may end up eating meat with it. Or if you make a meat bread, you may end up eating dairy with it and put some cream cheese on it or whatever. So you're not allowed to make such bread. And if you did make bread that's dairy or meat, it's going to be prohibited, unless there's specific halachas of if you made it small enough that it's for one particular meal, and that's going to be you made dairy bread for a dairy meal, and it's small amounts of bread that it's only for the just enough for that meal, that's permissible. Or if you made it a different shape, a particular shape, and you may know this, that in Israel the barekas, the dairy barekas are triangular for this very reason, so that people, because you can't tell what's inside the bareka, so the parv barekas are square or rectangular, and the dairy barekas are triangular. In any case, so the Gemara says, Ahu tanura, a certain oven, the tacha beitichya, that they had smeared fats, schmaltz on it as a grease, and then they baked the bread. Asra Rabbi Bar Elai lamechla l'rifta. So Rabbi Bar Elai prohibited eating the bread that was made there. He said, look, it's fleshik bread, and you're not allowed to eat it. And he says, even if you're not going to eat it with dairy, and you're just going to dip it in salt, you can't eat it. And it's prohibited for forever, meaning even if you had reheated the oven, it's too late. The oven is now fleshik, and it's going to be prohibited. And on this part, the Gemara is going to challenge it. So, because maybe you're going to eat some of the bread in kutach, which was a dairy dip. We don't have to go into how delicious kutach was right now, just that it was a dairy dip. And if you're going to have bread that's a fleshik, that had a meat grease as the grease in the oven, it's going to be prohibited. So Mesave, the Gemara challenges this. Ein lashon asiza b'chalav. You know, the halacha is you can't use milk in your bread, because if you do, it's going to be dairy bread, and there's a concern that you're going to eat it with meat. By the way, the reason most commercial hot dog buns are not kosher is for this very reason, because they put in milk powder in it, right? And it's hot dog buns. It's made for fleshiks, right? It's made for meat. V'im lash, if you did make dairy bread, kol hapaskula asura, the entire bread is prohibited. Not only may you not eat it with meat, for sure not, but you're not allowed to eat the bread at all. Because the concern that this is the typical way of eating bread is eating bread with meat. And so if you have dairy bread, it's going to be prohibited. Unless, as we said earlier, if you made just enough for one dairy meal, that's permissible. Or if you made it in a different shape where you can tell that this is a dairy bread and not a parv bread. Similarly, and now we go to Lama base 30b. The halacha is you're not allowed to use fats, animal fats, to smear to grease the surface of the oven that you're going to put the bread on. V'imtash, and if you did, kala paskula asura, that's going to be prohibited because again, you can't make dairy bread or meat bread, because if you do, you may end up eating with the opposite. You may take the bread and put some cream cheese on it, and so therefore it's prohibited. Again, unless you made it in a certain shape or it's made for a specific meal and it's just enough for that meal. And here the halacha says, and how do you make the oven permissible again? How are you allowed to bake bread again in this oven? Unless you actually heat up the oven and burn out whatever fats were in it. But if you did put fire into the oven and reheat it, and this way burn out the fats that you had smeared on the oven, it's going to be permissible. Tiyufta said that's a contradiction to Rabbi Barilai, said that the oven is forever prohibited. It's not forever, only for that particular bread. But once you reheat the oven so hot that it is going to burn out the fats that you smeared on it, it's going to be permissible. And this is koshering the oven, which today we say self-clean, will kosher it, or depending on the oven, heating it to a certain temperature for a certain amount of time will kosher the oven. Well, if Rabbi Barilai was wrong and that ovens are kosherable, so why did Rav say you have to break the pots, earthenware pots? After all, you could just kosher it. No, he says you make a mistake. Rabbi Barilai and our conversation about the oven being koshered after you smeared it with fats to make your bread, that's talking about a metal oven. And that's kosherable. You can heat it up. The metal's not going to break. And so you can heat it up to a high temperature and it'll burn out whatever's absorbed inside the oven, inside the substance of the oven itself. But Rav, he was talking about a pot made of earthenware, pottery, and therefore that cannot be koshered. Or even in an oven, there may be a distinction. And an oven and a pot's going to be different. Even if they're both earthenware, there's going to be a distinction. By an oven, the fire is made to go on the inside. And therefore, it'll heat it to the degree that whatever substance is on the surface of the inside and maybe got absorbed into the walls is going to be burnt out because it has a significant heat, because you have the heat source in the oven itself. But a pot, you have the fire on the outside, underneath and the outside. And so it doesn't kosher when the food is on the inside and is absorbed on the inside of the pot. So it's not going to kosher it properly. Now, the Gemara says, okay, so take a bunch of coals, put it inside your pot, earthenware pot on the inside, and that'll kosher it. The Gemara says, he says, no, he's not going to do it properly because he's afraid that the pot's going to break. Because an oven is made to be heated on the inside and can withstand the heat. A pot is made for heating on the outside, and if you put coals on the inside, it's earthenware. It may expand and explode and break, and so you're not going to do it properly. You're not going to put coals on the inside, and because you're afraid it's going to break, and so there's no way of koshering. Anytime something you may be concerned it'll break in the koshering process, that's significant reason to say you're not going to kosher it properly and heat it to what temperature it needs to be, and you can't kosher. Hilkach, and therefore, hi buchya, buchya was sort of like a thermos, which would have pockets on the outside, basically made of tiles, sections, and they would put coals on the outside to maintain or to heat with the substance that's inside, usually a liquid. And so this buchya, which had haseka mebechutz, it had its heating elements on the outside. You can't kosher it. It's earthenware, and you're not going to put the heat source on the inside. The heat source made to be on the outside, and it won't kosher properly. But if you did decide to fill it with hot coals in order to kosher it, it would be okay. Once we're talking about koshering for Pesach, Ravina said to Ravashi, "Hanesakini the Pesach, knives. How do you kosher them for Pesach?" Said, "I buy new ones." Amar Le said, thank you very much. Teinachmar. That's great for you that you can afford that. The Efshale. Delay Efshale Mai. But what about someone who can't afford new knives for Pesach? What are they supposed to do? How do they kasher for Pesach? Amar Le Anna Ke'en Chadta Kamina. He says, you're right. I didn't mean to say that everybody should buy new knives. I understand that not everybody can afford that. What I meant to say is that renew them, make them like new. How do you do that? Katayu betina, cover the handle, which is usually made of another material, not metal, let's say wood. So take the handle of the knife and cover it with clay so that it doesn't burn. Uparzalaya benura, and then take the metal part and stick it into the fire. And then you can take off the clay from the handle and stick the handle into boiling water. And that way you've kashered your knife. The metal went into hot water, into fire, and you protected the handle. And then you put the handle into boiling water. However, the halacha is that you don't have to stick the knife directly into the fire. It's sufficient to just put it into boiling hot water. Now, the truth is that a spit and a rotisserie rod and things that actually cook directly on fire, so your grill grate, those actually need libun. Those actually need to be heated up by fire to a high temperature in order to extract it. But a knife is unique because even though the knife itself may touch, you may cut chametz directly off of the fire, directly out of a fire. So it's coming into contact with the prohibited item without a liquid medium. It's cutting a hot item, but nevertheless, it's typically not used directly on the fire. And even though sometimes you may stick a knife into something directly on the fire, you don't have to be choshesh for that, concerned for that, and you can kasher your knives in boiling water. As long as kli rishon, it's in the initial vessel of the boiled water, and the way you do that is, as we'll see, it's got to be boiling water directly on the fire in a running boil. Amar Avuna b'Rei Rav Yeshua, eitz parur mag'ila b'reischin, a wooden spoon essentially, which is used to stir food. You can kasher that for Pesach by putting it into boiling water, as long as it's b'kli rishon in the initial pot of boiling water. Kasavar, because the opinion is kaboloi kachpoltoi, as it can absorb, so too it'll spit it out. So how did the chametz get into the wooden spoon? Because you had a mushroom barley soup that you were stirring with this wooden spoon, and the barley obviously being in the water is chametz. So now it absorbed chametz from a boiling pot of soup. So if you put it back into boiling water, that same way that the chametz got into the spoon, it absorbed by the pores opening up from the heat of the pot and absorbing some of the substance. Well, that heat of the pot in the boiling water will open the pores again and extract that which went into it. Meremar was asked, Hani mani de kunya glazed earthenware. So they used to have earthenware. Some of it was just raw, essentially a clay pot without any coating. And that's what we were talking about before. And now we're talking about, what about clay pots, but it had a glaze on it, which made it smooth. So are you allowed to use this on Pesach? So the glaze came from different substances and had a different color. Uroka, if it's green, those are for sure prohibited because they are porous. So what's my question about the dark and the light, the white and red or white and black? What's Allah? Now the Gemara explains for sure. If it has actual cracks and crevices, whereas you see the porousness of the clay pot, so then it's going to be prohibited because you know that the substance that you're cooking in the pot is getting into the center of the clay itself, into the midst of the clay. Therefore, for sure, it's prohibited. As we said, earthenware, you cannot kasher it properly, so it's prohibited. But if it's very smooth on the inside, perhaps it's not porous, and perhaps it's not absorbent. So no, even very smooth pots, I've seen them get wet on the outside. If you put liquids or hot substances in an earthenware pot, you see the outside, which was dry and a lighter color, become dark and wet on the outer side of the pot. So you see that it's absorbing and seeping through. And so if it can seep through the substances in the pot, alma bali, so you see it is absorbent. Vasirin, therefore that it's prohibited. And now you can't kasher it, as we said, and we already know the Torah told us earthenware cannot be kashered, it has to be broken. Why is it distinct from wine, which is yayin nesach, wine that may have been poured for idolatry, which is prohibited? And over there, the Darish Meremar, when Meremar told us the halacha is mani the kunya ben uchma bechivri ben yeruka shari, that glazed vessels, regardless of whether it's green, dark, or light, it'll all be permissible. And even though you put the wine into it, the barrels themselves, these vessels, earthenware vessels, are going to be permissible. And if you're going to tell me, well, that's because the prohibited wine is only rabbinically prohibited because maybe somebody poured it for wine for idolatry, but it's not a Torah prohibition yet, unless you know. Right? Chametz deraisa, and chametz is a Torah prohibition. So what? Called the tikkun can the raisa tikkun. Whatever the Torah prohibited was prohibited in the same manner as the Torah prohibited. It says there's a distinction. Wine goes into the barrels cold, and it remains cold. A pot is more absorbent because whatever you're putting in there is hot, and so the pores open and it'll absorb more. Vessels that typically only service bread cold. So you have a storage container for your breadcrumbs, for instance. So it's only cold. So then you're allowed to just clean it out and use it for matzah because there's no absorption because it was used cold. However, where you do your sourdough, where you the vessel that contains your sourdough, which is very pungent and it has a fermentation strength. So since there's a fermentation, it is the strength of that will make the flavor go into the container, and the container itself will smell like fermentation and will taste like fermentation. So it has chametz in it. You're not allowed to use that for matzah, even though it was cold. And also something that contains vinegar would be the same as something that contains leavening, sourdough, shechemutze kasha, because it's a very strong fermentation and it's going to be prohibited. Amar Rava hani agmi de mechuza, these vessels of mechuza, hoyel v'tadiri lemelish buhu, since they typically need the dough in there, so that also causes fermentation. Lemelish buhu chamira, they need their dough in there. Umashu buhu chamira, and they let the dough rise. They let the dough rise in there. So kabesa'or, it's like a sourdough bread container, shechemutze kasha, and that it has the strength of the fermentation is so strong it absorbs even though it's cold. Pshita, and it seems obvious. Mao de tema kibin ravicha shalet ba'avira, and the reason he had to say this was, don't think since it's a large container there's enough air, and so the dough will not the dough flavor will not absorb as much as a sourdough flavor absorbs. And it doesn't absorb kamashmalah. Nevertheless, you can't use it because it does absorb some of the chametz on account of its fermentation from the rising dough. So it'll be the same as a sourdough container or the same as a vinegar container. They absorb on account of the